The marketplace of Dry Creek never softened its edges, not for women, not for men, and certainly not for those who stood at the mercy of gossip. By late afternoon, the place reeked of horses, spilled whiskey, and coal smoke. Peddlers barked their wares. Miners laughed too loud at jokes better left in saloons. Yet amid the rowdy hum of trade and barter, a silence spread like wildfire when the crowd saw her. She stumbled into the square barefoot, her dress torn and filthy, the once blue calico stained by dust and humiliation. Her dark hair clung in damp strands to her temples. At first, the men thought she was another beggar, some drifter's widow, begging for bread. But then the truth glared at them all. The front of her bodice bore a cruel scar of heat. The word "unwanted" seared in black, the fabric charred where an iron had branded her like cattle. The letters weren't neat. They wavered and puckered, proof of some hand holding her down while another pressed the mark deep into the cloth. Her in-laws had sent her away with a final insult. Their hatred burned for all the town to see. A boy snickered. Someone spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Women clutched their shawls tighter, muttering behind hands. A man at the well shouted, "Best keep walking. No place here for the thrown-out kind." The crowd tensed between mockery and pity, leaning closer, ready for the show. She did not cry. She pressed a trembling hand against the charred letters, as if by hiding them she could undo their sting. But shame leaked from her posture, head low, shoulders hunched, feet dragging through the dust. Each step carved her deeper into exile. From the livery's shadow, one man watched. Broad-shouldered, with a hat brim pulled low, he stood apart as he always did. Ethan Garrison, rancher of the West Flats, was a man used to solitude. His cattle obeyed his voice. His neighbors rarely heard it. Folks knew he carried a quiet grief that made him sparing with words. But in his silence, he saw more than most, and what he saw now set his jaw hard. The woman swayed, nearly falling. No one moved to help. A pair of miners nudged each other, laughing. Someone called out, "Her own family didn't want her. Who here's fool enough to take her in?" The insult echoed, louder than the laughter. Ethan stepped forward. Dust rose with each stride of his boots until he stood before her. She dared not meet his gaze, bracing for another curse, another shove. Instead, she felt a sudden rip of fabric. With a swift motion, Ethan drew his knife and cut away the branded strip of dress, the word "unwanted" tumbling into the dirt like shed skin. A hush swept the square. Without ceremony, he shrugged off his weathered coat and draped it over her shoulders. The coat smelled of leather and sun, of horses and the endless prairie. It cloaked her shame in an instant. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A shopkeeper hissed, "He's lost his senses." A ranch hand muttered, "Why bother? She's nothing but trouble." Ethan ignored them all. His voice, when it came, was low and steady. "You'll not brand a woman like stock again. Not while I've got breath in me." The woman finally looked up, her eyes wide, stunned by this stranger's defiance. Her lips parted, but no words came. Ethan did not wait for thanks. He offered his hand, calloused and scarred from years of work. She hesitated, glancing at the crowd, faces twisted with ridicule, curiosity, resentment. She had been cast out once already. She feared the weight of another rejection. But the hand remained steady, patient, and something in his eyes, quiet, unyielding, like the earth itself, offered a refuge she had never known. With a trembling breath, she placed her palm in his. The square erupted. Voices rose, derision, warnings, disbelief. "She's cursed!" one woman shrieked. "You'll regret it, Ethan!" shouted another. But Ethan's silence was louder than their noise. He guided her past them all, leading her through the gawking circle step by step toward his waiting. Horse tethered at the hitching post. Each stride carried the weight of choice. He had not spoken her name. He did not yet know it. but his actions spoke louder than vows. When he lifted her onto his horse, murmurs turned into outrage. "Fool rancher!" someone barked. "Mark my words, she'll ruin him." Others shook their heads, whispering like mourners at a funeral. The woman clutched the coat tight around her. For the first time since her in-laws had driven the iron against her dress, she felt the faintest flicker of protection. As Ethan mounted behind her, his arm steady at her back, he gave the crowd no glance. His voice, roughened by dust and years of restraint, carried over the square. "She's with me." No one dared follow. The horse started forward, hooves striking the earth with a rhythm that drowned the jeers. Behind them, the branded scrap of fabric lay in the dust, trampled by boots, soon to be forgotten by all but the woman who once bore. It ahead stretched the wide, endless plains, harsh, yes, but honest. And in that harshness, perhaps, the beginning of something unlooked for. Dignity, maybe even belonging. As the town shrank behind them, the woman turned slightly, studying the stranger who had spoken on her behalf. Her throat ached with words unsaid. Gratitude, fear, disbelief, they tangled inside her until all she could whisper was a broken truth. "Why?" Ethan's gaze fixed on the horizon. "Because no one's unwanted, not if I've got a say." The sun hung low, gilding the prairie with firelight. And though neither of them knew what waited at his ranch, one thing was certain. Before sunset, the course of their lives had shifted forever. The trail home ran west under a tin sky. Ethan kept the mare to a walk. The woman sat forward, wrapped in his coat. Behind them, Dry Creek dwindled. Ahead, flats opened. Grass, sage, a windmill ticking like a clock. His place showed near dusk. Cottonwoods. By a creek, a low barn, a fence that begged mending. Smoke lifted from the stovepipe. A brindled cowdog loped out. "Easy, Scout," Ethan said, and the dog fell in. He dismounted and offered his arm. She slid down, light and stiff, as if shame had hollowed her bones. "Water's inside," he said. "Food, too." He handed her a sack. "Beans, bread, apple if you want it." Her fingers shook around the apple. Inside, he lit the lamp. Honey light softened the corners. Table, stove, peg rail, a small room off the kitchen with a narrow bed and folded quilt. He pumped a tin cup. She drank quick, then paused, as though apology were owed for being thirsty. "My name's Ethan Garrison," he said. "Folks call me Ethan." She set the cup down. "Eliza?" The name came small but whole, as if speaking it rebuilt a plank in a bridge. "All right, Eliza." He nodded toward the room. "You can take that. The latch sticks. Pull hard." He took down a small box. Salve, clean cloth, needle and thread, a pair of wool socks tied with twine. He set them on the table and looked aside. "The coat will do for now. I'll ride to Harper's when I can. No one will trouble you here." She nodded. The dog sat by her knee. She offered a hand. The tail thumped. "I can earn my keep," she whispered. "I'm not afraid of work. Work's here if you want it. Rest's here if you need it." Dawn came pale. Ethan went out early to check the corral and the west fence where posts had rotted. Eliza woke to the sounds of a life, already moving. The shovel, the pump, the clink of a bit. She washed, then studied the charred place where letters had been. The coat hid the worst. The phantom still burned. She braided her hair and tied it with a strip torn from a worn hem. She found flour, lard, and a crock of starter. Her hands remembered kitchens before grief. When Ethan came in, the room smelled of bread. He stopped in the doorway, hat in his hands. "I didn't know if you'd like it," she said. "Smells like a mercy," he said. They ate in quiet. Thick slices, beans warmed, coffee black. He told her where the pump handle stuck, how the stove drew in a crosswind, where the creek ran shallow enough to wash. He did not ask about the iron. His silence was a mercy too. After breakfast, she tried to help outside. She gathered eggs, wary of the red hen who pecked with the authority of a queen. The hen tagged her thumb. She hissed and refused tears. Ethan, at the fence, watched without comment. When she reached the porch, he met her with salve. He took her hand only long enough to dab and rap. "She pecks everyone," he said. "Even me." A ghost of a smile. "Especially me." She laughed once, brief, surprised. By noon, wind lifted dust. Ethan studied the fence. "I'll set new posts after dinner." He glanced at her hands. "Don't have to, but if you want to learn, I'll show you." "I want to," she said. They carried tools: shovel, digger, auger, staples, 2 cedar posts. The ground gave grudgingly. Ethan showed her how to lean into the digger and cut the circle clean. She sweated, hair damp at her temples. When the post stood plumb and tamped, earth held. Something in her steadied. "Good," he said. She learned how wire bites, how a stretch hums when set right. She missed one staple and blooded her knuckle. He passed the clean cloth without fuss. No scolding, no pity. Just 2 people in the sun, raising a boundary the wind would respect. Late afternoon gentled. They walked the line, checking. The dog ranged ahead. Grasshoppers sprang like sparks. At the far corner, Eliza stopped. On a low limb hung a scrap of charred calico caught by the wind, remnant torn free when he cut the brand. She reached, then let her hand fall. "Leave it," Ethan said softly. "It doesn't say a thing about you that I'll keep." They turned for the cabin together. She washed and made stew with onions and a twist of pepper. Ethan came in later. Then the light, shoulders tired, boots scarred with mud. He paused on the threshold as if measuring the day against the room's quiet. "You fixed the latch," she said. "Stubborn things answer to patience," he said. They ate with the ease of those who have worked side by side. She told him small pieces: husband dead, in-laws cold, the morning they set the iron to her dress and called it mercy. He listened without a single why. The kettle sang. The dog snored. "I'm not a thing to be branded," she said. "No," he answered. "You're a person to be called." "Called what?" He met her eyes. "Eliza." Outside the first stars rose. Inside, bread cooled for tomorrow, and Hope, cautious and ordinary, drew up a chair and stayed. The house breathed, and the night finally felt kind. Storms on the prairie had a way of arriving unannounced. By mid-morning, the air grew thick, pressing against the skin, a stillness like breath held too long. Eliza was washing linens at the creek when the dog raised his head and barked sharp. She glanced toward the horizon. A wall of dark clouds stacked heavy and fast, crawling over the flats like cavalry in a charge. She gathered the linens, hands fumbling as wind began to snap. The dog circled close, ears flattened. Across the field, Ethan was driving posts. He straightened, hat brim lifting, and saw what she saw. With long strides he came, carrying the hammer like a weapon. "Storm's rolling quick," he said. "Help me batten the barn." They worked side by side, he securing shutters, she dragging tack into corners, both racing against the first sheets of rain. Horses screamed at the sudden thunder. Ethan caught a halter rope just as a gelding reared. "Steady!" he barked, voice firm but calm. Eliza reached for another rope, arms straining, mud splattering up her skirts. The storm broke full then, wind slamming doors, rain slicing sideways, lightning cracking the world white. Inside, the barn smelled of hay and fear. They moved among the animals, stroking muzzles, tying knots, speaking low. Eliza's hair clung in wet ropes, her palms stung raw, yet she held her ground. She did not shrink from thunder, nor from the eye, memory of irons pressed to fabric. Something in her rose stubborn. She would not be branded weak again. By nightfall, the storm blew itself ragged, leaving silence broken only by dripping eaves. Ethan leaned against a post, water running down his neck. Eliza sank onto a hay bale, chest heaving. Their eyes met in the lamplight. Neither spoke, but each read in the other, a measure of respect, newly forged. The next day the land bore the storm's cost. Fences sagged, a trough lay overturned, and a section of rail had collapsed. Together they set to mending. Eliza carried rails twice her weight, teeth clenched, arms trembling. A neighbor rode by, reining his horse to watch. "That one?" he called, pointing at her. "Ain't she the one they sent off? Best send her. Back before she shames you further." Heat flared across Eliza's cheeks, but before she could drop the rail, Ethan's voice cut clean. "She stays, and she'll outwork you by sundown." The neighbor snorted, spat, and rode on. But the words stayed, sinking deep. Outwork them, prove them wrong. That evening she drove Staples until her palms blistered, until sweat streaked the dust from her face. When the fence stood strong again, she stared at it with a strange pride, as though each post was a pillar against the judgment of men. That night, by the fire, Ethan poured warm water into a basin and slid it toward her. "For your hands," he said. She lowered her blistered palms into the water and bit back tears at the sting. He waited, quiet, until she dared to look at him. "They'll heal harder," he said. "So will you." Days stretched into weeks. Chores became rhythm, bread in the morning, fence or field by noon, sewing by lamp at night. The scarred coat remained hers, a shield against memories. Sometimes, when she folded it carefully at day's end, she traced the rough seams where he had mended it years before, wondering what grief had driven him silent. One morning she overheard voices at the gate. Ethan's in-laws had ridden into town and come searching. She stiffened as their harsh tones carried across the yard. "You've no right to keep her," the brother-in-law barked. "She owes us work. You think one coat makes her yours?" Ethan stood unflinching, hands loose at his sides. "She owes you nothing. She's our burden. She was your cruelty." The man swung down from his horse, fists bunched. Before Ethan could move, Eliza stepped forward, skirts dusting her boots. Her voice cut steady, though her knees shook. "I'll not return with you. I carried your fields, your hearth, your grief, and still you named me unwanted. No more," the man sneered. "You're nothing but a mouth to feed." She squared her shoulders. "Then watch me feed more than myself." Behind her, Ethan's presence loomed like a wall. The in-laws faltered beneath the weight of 2 stairs, hers alight with defiance, his hard as stone. At last they spat into the dirt and turned their horses. When the riders vanished, Eliza trembled, her breath ragged. Ethan touched her arm, lightly, just enough to anchor her. "You spoke true," he said. For the first time she allowed herself a small, shaky smile. That evening, while mending the quilt, Eliza took the charred scrap of cloth, the branded "Unwanted" Ethan had cut away, and set it aside. Later, when she pieced squares together, she stitched the ragged edge in, not to keep the word, but to remind herself how far she had come. What once marked shame could become part of something warm, useful, enduring. As firelight flickered across the cabin walls, Ethan looked up from whittling. "Why keep it?" "Because I'll never let them own the story of me," she said. He nodded, a rare softness in his eyes. "Then it's yours to claim." Outside, coyotes yipped across the flats. Inside, Eliza bent back to her quilt. For the first time since exile, her heart beat steady, not frantic. Trial had tested her. Trial had not broken her. The prairie never let peace linger for long. That summer, the grass grew brittle under the sun, and tempers in town grew brittle with it. Whiskey flowed faster, wages shrank thinner, and the shadows of men stretched meaner in the saloon lamplight. Eliza had begun to walk into Dry Creek each Saturday with Ethan's list: flour, salt, kerosene. At first she'd gone stiff as a deer, braced for spit and whispers. Now, though eyes still followed her, She lifted her chin and carried her basket with quiet resolve. Still, one evening, as the sky bled orange and she and Ethan tied the last sack of grain to the mare, a stumbling figure lurched from the saloon door. "Garrison!" the drunk slurred. He was broad, sweat-stained, with a revolver hanging loose from his hand. "You think you're better than the rest of us? Taking in cast-offs, claiming them as wives?" His eyes fell on Eliza, narrowing into a cruel grin. "Let me have a look at the brand, girl." Ethan moved before she breathed. He set himself between her and the man, voice calm as winter steel. "You're drunk. Go home." But the drunk stumbled closer, raising his pistol half in mock, half in menace. The crowd thinned, shopkeepers ducking back into doorways. The silence of cowardice filled the street. "Home?" The man laughed. "Home's where men don't." "Dress cattle in coats. Step aside. Let's see if she's worth the trouble." The barrel swung toward Eliza. Ethan's hand shot out, faster than thought, striking the gun aside. The shot cracked skyward, scattering doves off the church roof. In the same breath, Ethan gripped the man's wrist, twisting until bone popped. The pistol fell into the dirt. "Enough," Ethan said. His voice carried across the boardwalks, not loud, but final. The drunk spat curses, clutching his arm. He glared once more at Eliza, but her eyes met his, steady, unflinching. She did not look away. Something in that gaze burned, hotter than his whiskey rage. He stumbled back into the shadows, muttering. The street exhaled. Shopkeepers peeked. Someone murmured, "She stood firm." Another grudgingly, "He don't bluff." Ethan stooped, scooped up the pistol, and emptied its rounds into his palm. He dropped the shells into a bucket by the hitching post. "No more trouble tonight," he said, as if sealing it. Then he turned to Eliza. "You all right?" She nodded, though her knees trembled. His hand hovered near her shoulder, close but not claiming, offering steadiness if she chose it. She drew in breath and whispered, "I'm all right, because you were here." They rode home in silence, broken only by the hoofbeats. But the echo of that street confrontation lingered. Fear, yes, but also a fierce thread of belonging stitched deeper between them. 2 weeks later, another kind of threat arrived. Lightning struck the ridge east of their land. By dawn, fire rolled down the slope, devouring dry grass. A neighbor galloped past, shouting, "Wind's carrying it west! Get your stock out!" Ethan wasted no words. "Barn first," he told Eliza. Smoke stung their eyes as they worked. Ethan, driving horses toward the creek, Eliza dragging water buckets, sloshing flames at the fence line. Heat blistered her arms, but she refused to fall back. At one moment, sparks caught her skirts. She slapped them out with bare hands, skin screaming. Ethan turned, saw the smoke rising from her hem, and his chest clenched. "Eliza!" He was at her side in 3 strides, dousing cloth with his own bucket, his hands gripping her shoulders. "You'll kill yourself!" "I won't leave you to fight alone," she gasped. Their eyes locked, fury and fear in his, stubborn devotion in hers. Then, together, they faced the flames again. By evening, neighbors arrived with wet sacks, beating back the fire's edge. At last, wind shifted, rain rolled in, and the blaze hissed to smoke. Fields lay blackened, fence posts smoldering. The barn roof was singed, but it still stood. Eliza leaned against the well, her chest ragged, her hands raw. Ethan stood nearby, soot painting his face. When he looked at her, it was not with the silence of a man tolerating another burden. It was the gaze of a man who had fought beside her, trusted her strength, and nearly lost her to the flames. "You stood with me," he said simply. "And you with me," she answered. His jaw worked as though more wanted saying, but he only nodded. The bond between them no longer rested on pity or defiance of gossip. It had been tempered in fire. That night, in the cabin, Eliza tended her burns with salve while Ethan replaced a shattered latch. She broke the quiet. "They'll keep coming." "Won't they? The storms, the drunks, the fires." He sat back, meeting her weary eyes. "This land doesn't promise peace, only the chance to stand." She folded the quilt square she had sewn from the branded scrap, pressing it into her lap. "Then we'll stand." Ethan reached across the table, not touching her hand but resting, his close, a space bridged only by choice. She let her fingers shift, just enough that the edges brushed. The dog stirred at the hearth. Outside, the night smelled of wet ash. Inside, something new, quiet, fierce, undeniable, took root between them. The fire had scarred more than the pasture. Fences still needed mending, stores ran low, and both Ethan and Eliza carried burns and bruises into the days that followed. Yet something had changed between them. The neighbors who once sneered now stopped by with boards or feed, nodding quietly at Eliza as if admitting, begrudgingly, that she had stood the trial and not faltered. It was the children, though, who tipped the scales. Ethan's sister lived a day's ride north. She brought her 2 little ones to stay while her husband took a long cattle drive. The children arrived dusty and wide-eyed, the boy no older than 6, the girl just past 4. They clung at first, unsure of the woman in the rancher's coat. But Eliza crouched to their level, offering bread fresh from the oven and a smile that trembled but held. The boy studied her face, then asked bluntly, "Are you Mama now?" The words struck like a stone in the quiet. Ethan froze, his jaw tight. Eliza's throat constricted, unsure whether to correct or deny. But the girl pressed close against her skirts and whispered, "You smell like home." Eliza bent, hugging them both. Her eyes blurred. "If you want me to be," she said softly. From the corner, Ethan's gaze softened in a way she had never seen, like a door easing open to reveal something long guarded. The days with children turned the cabin into a different world. Mornings began with giggles and the thump of small feet racing to the table. Eliza poured porridge and tied hair ribbons. Evenings filled with stories by lamplight, little heads drowsing against her lap. At first she feared overstepping, afraid Ethan might draw back, declare such tenderness not hers to give. But one evening, when the boy scraped his knee on the porch, she washed and bandaged it. The child sniffled, then leaned into her shoulder. Eliza glanced at Ethan in silent question. He only nodded once, firmly. "You're Mama," the boy declared. "Mama fixes hurts." Ethan's voice came steady. Then that settled. Not everyone accepted so quickly. In town, whispers still lingered. At church the following Sunday, when Ethan led Eliza and the children up the steps, some turned their heads. But when the little girl slipped her hand into Eliza's, tugging her forward with innocent trust, the murmur died to silence. A few women even offered shy nods. After service, the justice of the peace approached. A man grizzled with years, he studied the pair with an appraising eye. "You've carried yourselves as man and wife already," he said. "If it's your will, I'll marry you proper this evening. Save the town more talk." Eliza's chest tightened. She looked at Ethan, fear and longing warring within her. He had spoken few words of affection. His language was action, not sentiment. Would he agree? Ethan's answer was simple. He touched the brim of his hat. "By sunset, then." The justice nodded and walked on, leaving them staring at each other in the sunlight. That evening, neighbors gathered near the cottonwoods by the creek. The air smelled of wild mint and damp earth. Children ran barefoot, chasing fireflies. The crowd buzzed with curiosity, some eager, some bitter, but all unable to stay away. Eliza wore her plainest dress, still patched, still scarred, yet washed and pressed until it shone with dignity. Over her shoulders lay the coat Ethan had given her the day they met. Its weight no longer felt like charity. It felt like covenant. The justice spoke the vows simply, his voice carrying over the murmuring water. Ethan's answers came quiet, but unwavering. I will. When it was Eliza's turn, her voice shook, then steadied. I will. The children clapped, cheering. Mama! Papa! Their joy rang louder than the whispers of skeptics. Then something unexpected happened. As the ceremony ended, Eliza pulled from her basket the quilt she had been piecing. The crowd gasped. When they saw, stitched among the bright squares, a charred scrap, the remnant once branded with Unwanted. Now framed by color and warmth, the word was unreadable, swallowed into a greater whole. This was my shame, she said, voice trembling but fierce. Now it is our beginning. The murmurs shifted, some embarrassed, some moved. Even the bitterest tongues fell still. Ethan placed a hand over hers, covering the quilt. No one brands my wife but love itself, he said. By twilight, their marriage was sealed, not only in the justice's words, but in the children's laughter, in the neighbors' reluctant respect, in the sky burning red over the cottonwoods. For the first time since she had been cast out, Eliza felt wholly named. Not burden, not cast off, not branded, wife, mama, belonging. And when Ethan led her back to the cabin, the coat around her shoulders and the quilt in her arms, she walked, taller than she ever had, her shame transformed into legacy before the eyes of all who once mocked her. Summer withered into autumn, and the earth hardened. Rains failed, grass shriveled, and the creek shrank to a trickle. The prairie whispered hunger. Ethan knew it. Eliza read it in the worried set of his shoulders each morning as he counted bales in the loft. One evening, as they sat at the table with the children nodding drowsy beside bowls of thin stew, Eliza broke the silence. How long will the stores hold? Ethan set his spoon down. If the drought breaks, we'll see it through. If it doesn't, he shook his head. She straightened. Then we'll find a way. I won't let this land beat us. He met her eyes, and for the first time since the fire, he allowed himself a small, weary smile. You sound like you've run a ranch all your life. I've run harder things than dirt and drought, she said. The days turned harsher. Stock bawled at empty troughs, fences leaned under the dry wind, and neighbors began selling off herds. Some packed wagons, leaving fields abandoned to dust. Yet Eliza would not bend. She rose before dawn, rationed flour into careful loaves, turned scraps of cloth into useful garments, and worked the earth with her own hands, digging, hauling, coaxing meager greens from a parched garden bed. At first Ethan argued, telling her to spare herself. But when he saw her blistered hands push seed into cracked soil, when he saw her bent over the rows by lantern light, he realized her will was as stubborn as his. He stopped arguing. Instead, he worked beside her. One afternoon, clouds threatened rain, but offered only a taunting wind. Eliza stood in the field, dust stinging her eyes. I won't quit, she whispered, half prayer, half defiance. Ethan, watching from the fence line, heard her. Something in him broke and healed at once. The recognition that she had turned. From burden to partner, from cast-off to cornerstone. Then sickness struck. The little girl, flushed and trembling, lay in bed as fever consumed her. Eliza held cool cloths to her brow, whispering lullabies half-remembered. Panic clawed at her chest. She needs medicine, she told Ethan, voice sharp with fear. He saddled his horse before the words were finished. I'll ride to town. Eliza caught his hand. Come back. His eyes, steady, unyielding, met hers. I will. He rode into the storm of dust and dusk, his figure swallowed by the horizon. Hours dragged, each minute an eternity of prayers whispered into the child's tangled hair. At last, hoofbeats thundered outside. Ethan stumbled in, dust-caked and weary, but with a packet of medicine clutched tight. Together they nursed the girl through the night. At dawn, her fever broke. Relief washed over them both, leaving them leaning against the bedpost, shoulders touching, tears unashamed. "You saved her," Eliza whispered. "We saved her," Ethan answered. Winter came cruel on the drought's heels. Snow fell heavy, burying the land in silence. Woodpile dwindled, stock huddled gaunt. One night, as the wind howled and frost crept across the window panes, Eliza wrapped the children in quilts and turned to Ethan. "We've stood storms and fire. We'll stand this too." He nodded. Together. They worked without rest, breaking ice for water, cutting wood by lantern, snaring rabbits when supplies ran out. When Ethan collapsed with fever himself, Eliza shouldered the chores alone. She hauled water, fed stock, even mended a section of fence, muscles screaming, breath freezing in her lungs. At night she sat by his bed, whispering fiercely, "You gave me a name. You gave me a life. I won't let you go now." Her stubborn care pulled him back from the edge. When at last he rose, pale but alive, he found her at the hearth, hair loose, face lined with exhaustion. He stepped forward and for the first time touched her cheek with reverence. "Eliza," he said. Nothing more, just her name, yet it held the weight of vow. She leaned into his touch, eyes closing. "I'm yours," she whispered. Their hands found each other, rough and scarred, yet steady. In that simple touch, a culmination of every trial, every fire and famine, every moment that had burned away shame and left only bond. Spring came slow but sure. Grass returned in shy shoots. The creek ran again, and calves bawled in the meadow. The land had tested them with every cruelty it possessed, and they had endured, not as strangers, not as savior and saved, but as partners. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Ethan and Eliza stood at the fence, watching the children chase fireflies. Ethan reached for her hand, and this time, she took his without hesitation. He turned, eyes steady. "I called you wife before sunset once. I'll call you that till the last of my days." Her throat tightened, but she smiled through the tears. "And I'll answer till the last of mine." Their lips met, gentle, sure, not born of obligation but of chosen love. The prairie stretched endless, harsh and holy, but for the first time it felt like home. Years rolled forward as they always did on the prairie, measured not by clocks but by harvests, storms, and the growth of children. What had begun in humiliation and fire hardened into something enduring. The cabin grew into a homestead. A second barn rose, fences stretched farther, and the garden Eliza had coaxed from drought became a spread of green that fed more than their table. The quilt she had pieced, stitched from bright squares and that one charred remnant, lay across their bed for years, growing soft with use, its story whispered in every seam. Children's voices filled the yard. The little boy and girl, once guests, became theirs in all but blood. In time, more children came. Sons who carried Ethan's quiet gaze, daughters who carried Eliza's unbreakable spirit. Neighbors who had once mocked, now sought advice, leaning on the garrisons when their own fields faltered. Respect, reluctant at first, settled into certainty. This house was built on rock. One evening, many years later, Ethan stood at the edge of the field, hair silver under his hat. Eliza came beside him, her shawl tight against the breeze. The land stretched golden, waving with wheat. A lifetime lay between them and that square in Dry Creek, where she had been branded unwanted. "Do you ever think of that day?" she asked quietly. He nodded once. "Every time I see you walk this land, proud. Every time I hear them call you Mama. Every time I look at this place and remember what it was without you." She smiled faintly. "And now? Now it's home. Because of you." She slipped her hand into his. "Because of us." Time, however, is as relentless as prairie wind. Seasons wore on. Children married, moved, brought their own little ones back to the homestead, to run barefoot under the cottonwoods. Ethan's step grew slower, his silence deeper. Eliza's hands, though still strong, carried the lines of decades. On one winter morning, Ethan sat by the fire, quilt draped over his knees. His voice, roughened by age, broke the quiet. "Do. You regret it, Eliza? That I cut that word from your dress and put my coat on your shoulders?" She looked at him, this man who had stood against mockery, storm, fire, famine, and shook her head. "Regret? You gave me back my name. You gave me everything." He reached for her hand, holding it in both of his, eyes closing as if to etch her face into memory. "And you gave me more than I ever deserved." The years after Ethan passed were not empty. Eliza carried on, surrounded by children and grandchildren who filled the cabin with laughter. When she quilted with the younger girls, she would lift that old square, the charred remnant stitched among bright colors, and tell the story, not of shame, but of redemption. "This," she would say, touching the faded cloth, "was once meant to mark me as nothing, but look at it now. It holds warmth, it holds history, it holds love." The girls would trace it with small fingers, eyes wide, learning not only to sew but to endure. When Eliza herself grew frail, she asked to be laid beside Ethan under the cottonwoods, where the creek whispered and the prairie wind carried the uai, scent of sage. Her children honored it. On her stone, they carved the words she had chosen: unwanted no more, beloved wife, mother, and matriarch. Neighbors came from miles around, remembering the woman who once walked through town in shame, and left it in honor. And long after both Ethan and Eliza had gone, the homestead remained. Wheat still waved, the cabin still stood, the quilt still warmed new generations. And in the memory of all who knew them, the story endured, how a man had cut away cruelty, draped a coat of belonging, and named a woman wife before sunset. The camera of memory fades on that quilt laid across a rocking chair, patched and frayed but whole. Children's laughter drifts on the wind. A voice, Eliza's, lingers in echo. "They gave me everything." The frontier was a place of dust, fire, and judgment, but it was also a land where broken lives could be remade. Eliza began with nothing but shame burned into her dress, cast aside like refuse. Yet one man's defiance, one coat on her shoulders, became the spark that rewrote her story. Together they stood through storms, fire, drought, and the cruel whispers of neighbors. Each trial bound them tighter, each hardship turned strangers into partners, and each act of love transformed humiliation into legacy. By the time the years had run their course, Eliza was no longer the woman branded unwanted. She was a wife, a mother, a matriarch whose name was spoken with reverence. What her in-laws meant for ruin became the very symbol of survival, stitched into a quilt that warmed generations. This is what the Wild West always promised, not an easy life, but a chance at redemption, a chance to belong. And sometimes, love itself was the fiercest frontier of all. If stories like this stir your heart, join us here. Subscribe, like, and share, because every week we uncover another tale where hardship forged hope and where love conquered even the harshest wilderness.